Okay, I'm here with JP Moreland, and today we are going to talk about consciousness. So, JP, if you could just take a moment to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Eric. I'm a distinguished professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University in Southern California. And I had training in theology at Dallas Seminary, and then my graduate work and PhD at the University of California, Riverside, and finally USC. So I've been married to Hope Moreland for a long time. I have 2 married daughters and 5 grandkids, so we're doing well.
There you go. That's great. Good to hear.
Thanks.
All right, so we're just going to get into it. Today we're going to talk about consciousness, like I said, and just right from the start, JP, what is consciousness, right? Because it's this experience that we're in every waking moment, and it's so obvious to us that it's not obvious, right? So if you could just break it down, what a consciousness is.
Sure. There are 3 ways to do that. The basic way is to give it what's called an ostensive definition. And that means to define it by pointing to examples of it. Now, the reason you have to do that is that sometimes one thing like bachelor can be defined in terms of something else. Unmarried male. Water can be defined in terms of hydrogen and 2 oxygens. So you can do that if the thing you're defining isn't basic and fundamental. That is, you can define it in terms of other things that are more basic. Like water is not basic because it's built up out of more basic things, hydrogen and oxygen. But eventually you reach a place where you can't keep going on a vicious infinite regress. So you have to stop with things that are primitive or basic, and consciousness is that sort of thing. There's nothing more fundamental in terms of which you could define it. And so the only thing you can do at that point is just point to examples. So the first way to do this is to say, well, consciousness would be when you have certain states like sensations or emotions or thoughts or beliefs or desires, or when you exercise free choice. So that's number one. Consciousness is states like this. The second way would be to say that for every state of consciousness C, there is a what it is like to be in C. So there is a what it is like to be in a pain state, or a tasting of cherry pie state, or in a fearing or anger state, or a thinking that snow is white. That's different than thinking that George Washington was there. So there's always a what it is like to that state, but nothing physical has that. No electron, negative charge doesn't. There's no what it's like to be negative charge. So that's the second way. The third way to define consciousness would be to say that some state is a state of consciousness, just in case the subject has private access to that state. And what that means is that for every physical object or every physical property, like being 8 feet tall or having such and such mass, or any state of a physical object, like being in a state of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. All of those, everything physical is accessible publicly. Every way I have of knowing about anything physical is available to everybody else with the right training. But I have a way of knowing about my conscious states that's not available to anybody else, and that is through private introspection. So consciousness is a certain sort of thing to which the subject has first-person private access to it, but that's not true of his brain or a brain state or anything like that. So 3 ways: ostensive pointing, there's a what it's like to consciousness, and we have private access to conscious states and only conscious states.
Right, like this intentionality.
Yeah, exactly.
That physical objects, they don't have that. They're completely devoid of that.
That's absolutely right.
Okay, so the second question here is, does consciousness emerge from the brain? So a lot of people, in fact, they might not even talk about consciousness. They'll just say, well, it's just your brain. Everything's just your brain. And then others will, they'll say there's no way it can emerge from the brain. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that consciousness can't be a state of the brain, because there are things that are true of conscious states that aren't true of brain states. Like some conscious states can be true or false, like the state of having a certain thought. But there's no such thing as a brain state being true or false. Again, brain states have a certain geometrical properties. They would have a certain shape and size and location. But my belief that grass is green doesn't make any sense to say, well, what is the shape of that belief, and how big is it? And where is it located? Closer to your left ear or right ear? Now, there is a place where the brain activity that is activated while I'm having that belief is located, but that's different from the belief itself. So there are things true of conscious states that aren't true of brain states, and vice versa. So they can't be the same thing. Really, Eric, they exist in a dependency or a causal relationship. They can cause each other and so on. Now, what about a consciousness emerging from the brain? Well, I don't believe there are any such things as emergent properties. Now, by that I mean not a new structure. Like if you take hydrogen and oxygen together, you get a new structural property, being water, but all that is a rearrangement of what already existed into a new structure. No problem with that. We're talking about the emergence of some brand new kind of property that wasn't present before that. And the many problems of that are that but I'll state one. Emergence is a case of getting something from nothing. If you take purely material stuff or entities, like let's just say the brain, and you apply physical processes to it, like maybe certain electricity comes to it and so on, then what you're going to end up with is you're going to produce a different physical state in the brain, but you're not going to get something totally different, right, that wasn't there to begin with. Now this is why a lot of contemporary physicalists have moved to some kind of panpsychism, which is the idea that every object, including the universe as a whole, has some diminished form of consciousness. And that solves a problem because they don't have to figure out a way to get consciousness in you and me from nothing. It's the actualization of latent consciousness in the parts of our brain. Now, they do have what's called the unity problem, and that's how can I just be one single self when I'm really a combination of billions of little tiny conscious entities. But that's right, a different issue. So no, I don't think consciousness emerges from the brain. I think it belongs in a subject or the soul. Mm-hmm. And I think conscious states can be caused by the brain. I mean, if I get stuck with a pin, that'll cause certain C fibers to fire in my brain, and that'll cause me to have a conscious state of pain. One conscious state can cause another conscious state. So a feeling of thirst can cause a desire for water.
Right.
Sometimes I cause my conscious. Yes, there you go, dude. Our timing, man.
We're right on time.
Let's go
we plan this beforehand. Yeah. We plan this.
You are the man. And sometimes I cause my own conscious states by freely choosing just to think about a new thing instead of what I was thinking about. So different things can cause a conscious state, including your brain, but it doesn't emerge from nothing. It's a property of the self.
Great explanation. So question 3, this is a question that really interests me. What are the chances of consciousness arising on a naturalistic paradigm, right? So there was a time in the universe where there were no sensations, thoughts, desires, minds, and then all of a sudden this comes into being. On a naturalistic paradigm, that just seems highly improbable, if not impossible.
Well, it is virtually, I believe it's metaphysically impossible. But you have to understand something. Since the 1950s, I think the vast majority of philosophical physicalists were that way largely because they were naturalists. Mm-hmm. And they realized that if you are a naturalist, your universe begins with a big bang. You can't ask the question what caused it, because
right, that's like a brute fact.
Yeah. And then the history of the universe is simply a history of physical processes rearranging physical materials. So there's no way that you can get something brand new springing into being at a certain level of complexity of matter, because again, you get something from nothing. Mm-hmm. Now that's why, I mean, David Papineau, who's one of the leading naturalists of the last 40 years, said that the naturalists should identify brain states with conscious states, because if you don't, and you say they're different and conscious states are just correlated or related to brain states, but they're really mental, then you have to face this new question. Well, where in the world did it come from? Exactly. And that's a question that the thoughtful naturalist should want to avoid. Mm-hmm. And so the point is that if you start within the beginning where the particles, then the history of the world is going to be a history of a more complex and larger arrangement of particles.
Right.
If you start in the beginning was the logos, then your fundamental entity is characterized by consciousness, and there is no problem with explaining where it comes from because you start with that. So a theist has a great explanation for it.
Exactly. And that I was going to say as well, the atheist or the naturalist seems to resort to ad hoc reasoning, right?
Very
or
much
explanations.
So. Oh, it's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them reduce consciousness to something physical. That's not worked. And so since the late 1980s, more and more physicalists have adopted emergent. But emergent is just a name for the problem. It's not a solution.
Not an explanation.
Where does consciousness come from?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it emerges. Well, what does emergence mean? Well, consciousness just comes from matter. But that's the question.
It becomes pretty circular.
How does that happen? And saying it emerges is not an answer. It's a name for the problem.
Right. That's a great point. Okay. So question 4, what is the soul and how should we discern it from consciousness? Are they the same? Is consciousness the soul?
Great. These are just outstanding questions.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's very, very good. There are two ways of defining the soul that go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle up to the present. And one way is to say the soul is an immaterial substance that contains or possesses consciousness. So that's one way to do it. The second way to do it, that would be the way that Descartes would do it. So Descartes, that would be Cartesian dualism.
Yeah.
Now, there's another version called Aristotelian Thomistic dualism that would say that the soul is an immaterial substance or substance-like thing when they talk about substantial forms. So there's a division of opinion. Anyway, the soul is an immaterial substance that either contains the powers of life or the powers of life and consciousness. So for plants, the soul of a plant would be a principle in the plant that unifies it and makes it more than just an aggregate of parts, and it orchestrates the development of the plant as it moves towards being a mature member of its kind.
There's this telos within.
Yeah, that's right. Now, so for me, I just like to say the soul is an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body.
Okay.
That's the human soul and enlivens the body. Now, how are they different? how is the soul different from consciousness? Well, in the same way that a tomato is different from its color, redness. Redness is a property that belongs to the soul, to the tomato. Consciousness is a property of a whole bunch of different states that are contained within the self or the soul. So the soul is what has consciousness, and consciousness is a property of sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and all that,
Right.
that are unified and possessed by the soul. So the soul is what has consciousness. Consciousness is a property of what the soul has. So consciousness is in the soul, like redness is in the tomato, but the tomato is the thing that has the color.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so question 5, what would consciousness ultimately need to be grounded in?
This is another really good question. So the strict physicalist is going to say, well, it doesn't need to be, because we can reduce it to matter. That doesn't work for reasons I've already given you.
Yes, right.
The panpsychist is going to say that consciousness is ultimate and primitive and just is. The universe begins, and you have particles that have physical properties, but also the properties of consciousness. Mm-hmm. There's so many difficulties with that. One quick one is that consciousness and its relationship to the brain is contingent. Everybody pretty much admits that. So that you could have different states of consciousness correlated with the same brain state, and so on. So the panpsychist is stuck with this brute fact that's contingent. And a contingent fact cries out for an explanation as to why it's there.
Right.
You don't want contingent facts to be your brute facts unless they're the result of a free action. So you might say, well, why did this person, paint that picture? And the answer might be they just did. They might not have had another reason. Ultimately they just did, and that's all. Well, that's a legitimate question for a free act. Right. Well, the universe and consciousness is in our lives, the contingent consciousness has to be grounded in an ultimate brute fact that's a necessary fact, not
necessity.
A fact. So it doesn't invite an infinite regress, and that entity has got to itself be conscious. If you don't start within the beginning was a logos or some sort of conscious being, then you will have no explanation for why consciousness appeared subsequently in the history of the universe. So the best ground for consciousness is not a contingent fact. Well, it just happens to be true of all material objects that they're conscious. No, you want to have a necessary being that doesn't invite infinite regress, and that being has got to itself be conscious, and it must be the ground of finite consciousness.
Yeah, purely actual.
It's a powerful argument, actually.
It is very powerful. Yeah, I mean, God does seem to be the best explanation. Like you said, these contingent contingent facts are not even an explanation. It just stops there. You just stop and throw your hands up.
Well, it's sometimes cheating. I mean, Bill Craig called it taxi cab fallacy. So you ride the taxi cab, but then when you don't like where it's going, you jump out. Well, you say it's a brute fact, but yet there are further questions. So you've just jumped out of the taxi cab and said, I'm not following this any further down the road. I'm just stopping.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
It's arbitrary.
Right. Okay. Next question. What about brain damage and, say, mental illness? I mean,
I love this.
This is a really profound question, I think, because intuitively you get in a car accident, say, and your mental your cognitive faculties are just completely, they could be rendered they're destroyed. And
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
So how do you get around that?
Let me give you an example, and then I'll apply it. Suppose that I were in a car, and people had strapped the seatbelt in the driver's seat and locked it so I couldn't open it. And then they locked all the doors from the outside, and so I was stuck in the driver's seat of that car, and I couldn't get out. Obviously, my ability to get around town is going to depend on whether the car works. So, for example, if the steering wheel broke so that it would only turn right and not left, I would be limited as to how I could move and where I could go, because I was using the car to get around. Same if the car's engine completely broke down, I would not be able to do anything. But that doesn't prove I'm the car. That is consistent with the idea that I am what is in the car as its driver, and I depend on the car functioning while I'm in it. If I could get out of the darn thing, even though the engine was broken down, I might still be able to walk around town. Now, when you're in your body, one of the reasons God made the body was for us to have access to a power source that our soul depends on while we're embodied. So my eyes don't see anything. I see with my eyes. So I use my eyes as a tool to see things, but they don't see. I do. So, but if my eyes are put out, then I can't see. That doesn't mean my eyes are doing the seeing. It means that I depend on them while I'm in my body. Same with the brain. In order for me to engage in certain functions, my brain has got to be working. So, for example, the leading expert probably in the world on memories, who's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, came to Biola, and he's published more on memories than anybody, I believe, in the world. And the first thing he said in his lecture is, the idea that memories are in the brain, I don't even understand that claim. I don't even know what it means. Memories are not the sort of thing that could be in a brain. They're in the self.
Right.
Now, if the brain's damaged, you can't recover them. But it's kind of like a CD. Is there music in the CD? No, because you can hold it up to your ear and you can't hear anything. But if it's not damaged and you put it in the right retrieval system, the grooves will trigger music, not in the CD, but in the room. Well, consciousness is not in the brain, but it's in the soul. But what is in the brain are what you might say grooves, actually literally neurological grooves that have fired together like the CD. And if the brain isn't damaged and you are trying to retrieve, let's say, a memory, then you will, without intending, you will trigger the groove in your brain, which will cause a memory to occur in yourself or your soul. So just if the CD is damaged, you can't get music out of it. But that doesn't mean the music's in the CD. The CD is a purely physical thing. It just triggers music. Well, similarly, when I'm in my body, there's no consciousness or anything in my brain, but my ability to access or use different conscious states depends upon whether the CD's intact, my brain. And if it's damaged, I could still do it, but I don't have the tool I need while I'm in my body to retrieve those memories or whatever it might be. Now, in near-death experiences, when people die, they have a full range of visual sensations. They can hear things. They can actually go to places in the hospital and describe later what was happening 2 floors below that are later verified by nurses and doctors. They have memories. They remember who they are. They recognize, this one kid recognized his grandfather who he'd never met. And when he came back and told his dad about it, his dad showed him pictures of the grandfather and he said, no. He said, for one thing, Grandpa's wearing glasses in that picture, and nobody wears glasses in heaven. This kid's 5 years old. And then he says, that isn't Grandpa. So he's later, about 2 weeks later, they're leafing through some old journals, and there's a picture of his grandpa when he was in his 20s. He said, Dad, that's Grandpa right there. And his dad never said it was Grandpa. He saw his grandpa and could remember that out of his body.
Wow.
So while in the brain, we use it, and if it doesn't work, we don't work. But if we're out of the brain, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Which is hopeful.
Yep.
Which is hopeful.
Right. That's a great explanation. Okay. We already touched upon, is consciousness just a brute fact? We kind of touched upon that. So I think we could go on to the next question here. What are your thoughts on eliminativism?
Yeah.
And kind of what it is. I mean, it's the notion that we're really not conscious. Ultimately, it entails that.
Well, in the history of scientific theory change, where scientists go from one theory to another, sometimes the old theory is retained, but it is reduced to the new theory. Let me give you an example. The transition from the Bohr electron to the quantum electron was not seen as abandoning the Bohr electron, but in improving it. So if you were asked, the Bohr electron was a solid particle that moved through Newtonian space, and it was just a pure amount of solid stuff. Okay, now the quantum electron is more like this wave packet, and they're different. So if you were to ask a scientist, did the Bohr electron exist? They would say, yeah. Although we now know more about what it really was that Bohr didn't know. But sure, we still believe that our quantum electron is just a refinement of the Bohr electron. Okay, there's another example of theory change where the old entity is abandoned altogether. And that was a change from phlogiston chemistry to oxygen chemistry. When you heat a metal in the atmosphere, it gains weight. And the explanation for that was that it was losing phlogiston, and phlogiston had negative weight because the chemists in that time thought that heating was always a method of driving out impurities. Like when you heat a metal, you actually get rid of its impurities. So there must be, when you heat a metal in the atmosphere, you must be getting rid of something, but the thing gains weight. So what you're getting rid of must have negative weight. And that's not a crazy idea, because we believe in now negative matter and all kinds of weird notions. So, but now they eventually realized that no, that doesn't drive out phlogiston, it adds oxygen. So the reason a metal, when you heat it in the air, gains weight is something's being added to it. So phlogiston theory was eliminated. It was abandoned. Nobody would say oxygen is just a refinement of phlogiston. No, they're going to say, no, phlogiston was never something that existed. So the eliminativist says we can't reduce consciousness to brain states, but we don't have to. We can eliminate consciousness altogether. There never was such a thing. There are no thoughts, there are no beliefs. And this is often, I mean, it's so crazy, but it's often done not to sensations, but some eliminativists limit this to thoughts and beliefs. So now you might say, well, what about the thought that there are no thoughts? Well, the answer to that they give is that while thoughts don't exist, there are brain states that play the same role as thoughts. So no, there are no, I don't have the thought that there are no thoughts, but I have a brain state that fills in for that thought, and it plays the same kind of behavioral role in my linguistic community, because I will utter thoughts don't exist, and but the problem with that is that move ends up with brain states that don't have any semantic meaning or content to them. They're just brute physical states of the brain. So you have to get rid of cognitive meaning, which thoughts seem to have. I mean, there's a certain intentionality has to go by the board because thoughts are about something, but brain states aren't. Plus, guess what? If something plays exactly the same role as a thought does, then I'm going to say it's a thought by a different name. It's not something else. It's just a thought, but you're calling it something else. So that's eliminativism. And it is not garnered much favor because it's
Right.
pretty crazy.
Yeah. It just seems to like, multiply entities beyond necessity too. It just seems it's just absurd. Like why posit all of those things to try to get around something so
there you go.
Yeah.
You want to get rid of consciousness because you don't want to have to postulate something besides materialist evolution to explain our different features, and that would have to be God.
Correct.
And that's the truth of the matter. But there's a lesson here. This shows how far people are willing to go into craziness to avoid God. Now, I'm going to ask you, do you have to do that to retain your Christian, your integrity as a Christian theist? I don't.
No.
I mean, there are some things that I still need to solve, and
of course.
I've got great answers to. But if I had to go to that extreme and end up with this bizarre, bloated, ad hoc bunch of explanations in order to save my Christian theism, I'm sorry, but it wouldn't. I could not have intellectual integrity and be a Christian.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to follow the evidence and see where it leads, and try to avoid, like I said, multiplying entities beyond necessity, going into just deep waters of confusion and just ad hoc explanations. It's unnecessary.
Is a good example of that.
Yeah.
Good point.
Okay. All right, JP. So I think I heard you say you're a property dualist in a prior interview. If you could just explain that, and what's the difference between property dualism and substance dualism?
Okay. Well, I am actually both, but a property dualist is someone who says that conscious states are not physical states. The property of being conscious cannot be reduced to a physical property. So if you're a property dualist, you are claiming that consciousness is irreducibly and genuinely mental and not physical. But now, if that's all you hold, then that's consistent with you believing that it's the brain that has consciousness, or there's a soul that has consciousness. And so if you're just a property dualist and you stop at that, then you're going to claim that the brain is this odd material object that has physical properties, mass and so on, but it also has mental properties, consciousness. For a number of reasons, the brain is not the right kind of thing to have consciousness. So I am also a substance dualist because that means that I believe that there is an immaterial self or soul that is the bearer or possessor of irreducible consciousness.
Okay.
So it's kind of like thoughts have thinkers. You don't see thoughts floating around by themselves.
Right.
They always have a subject. Mm-hmm. And I believe that all conscious states are not ownerless. It's necessarily the case that they all have subjects that own them. And I think the soul is the best answer to what that is.
Okay. All right, let's see here. So another really interesting question in regards to death. So when we die, will our conscious experience carry over with that? Like, for example, when I die, will my memories still be within me? Will this subjective I-ness, right, exist within me? This intentionality, will I still be me from the first person experience?
Absolutely. And we now have, there have been 300 million near-death experiences in the world. In the United States, there have been something like 15 million. 1 out of every 25 persons has had an NDE in the last 30 years. So these have now been studied thoroughly by a group of highly credible academics that all were skeptical of them until they researched them, and almost virtually every single one of them became a believer in NDEs. I'll give you an example, and then I'll answer your question. Two research professors at the University of Connecticut Medical School did a study on 25 patients who were born blind and had never seen anything, but had near-death experiences, and when they came back, reported a whole range of things they had seen, but they lost their sight when they returned to their body. They did research on these 25 patients. There are more of them, but they chose these 25. And they demonstrated that it is beyond any question that they gained sight during this experience, because they were able to describe things that were easily verifiable that they could not have described by just feeling and so on. So now what these people report is that they do, it's not just consciousness that survives, but it's the self that has consciousness. So they are aware that they themselves are looking at their body and observing what the doctors are doing to revive them. They are aware of an angel or a deceased relative taking them through a tunnel and they meet Jesus Christ, and on it goes. So from tens of thousands of reports, the uniform acknowledgement is that not only does one's consciousness and one's memories continue, but so does the person or the self, without a body, admittedly, but the soul of the self of the person who has those memories and consciousness continues as well. This is now, I think, beyond reasonable doubt. And if you add to it the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and the promise that we will be with him in paradise, I think the deal is, for me, is closed. I have absolutely no fear of death. Absolutely none. My wife and I are actually looking forward to it. That's the God's truth. I'm not looking forward to the certain ways of dying. I mean, like my friend said, I don't mind dying. It's I don't want to get through the people.
Yeah, I that's what scares most people. Just how it's going to happen, right? That's the scary part. But if you just fall asleep peacefully and don't wake up, well, maybe that's good. I think that might be a good way to go.
Would be a bad way to go. I'll take that.
Okay. How would you respond to the interaction problem? How an immaterial soul can interact with a physical brain?
Very good question. The question, how could they interact, needs to be broken down into two separate questions. And the first one is that it is a request for a mechanism between conscious states and brain states by means of which they do things to one another. For example, how does turning on the key start the car? And what I'm looking for is for you to describe some intervening mechanism that is between the key and the starter, and the key starts that by working through this mechanism. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the same thing as how did you make that cake? And you'd have to describe the different processes you went through. If that's the question, then there is no how, because the connection between mind and brain is basic and immediate, and not by means of something in between them. Now remember, if A interacts with B and it has to do so by means of C, then you have to ask, well, how does A interact with C to do something to B? Right. Well, by means of some intervening mechanism, and you ultimately stop the regress by having to admit that some interactions are basic and primitive and not in virtue of some intervening mechanism, or you get an infinite regress. So if that's the question, then it is a category mistake, because there is no answer, because the interaction is direct and immediate. there is no intervening mechanism. Now, if the question is what I call an expression of skeptical exasperation, then it's kind of going like this. How in the world could such a thing happen? Give me a break. And the idea is sort of that, well, these are so different from one another. How in the world are you going to expect me to believe that some sort of thing like a pain is going to be able to interact with a bunch of mass and neurons? I don't see how that could be. So that's an expression of incredulity. And my answer to that is, number one, we have more reason to believe it happens than we do to believe the principle A can only interact with B if A and B are like one another. So that's the principle that underlies the skeptical question. And so the question is that a serious question? I mean, is that a pretty weighty question? Well, maybe, but I have more reason to know that once in a while I raise my hand, and when I get hit in the head, I get a little dizzy, or if somebody sticks me with a pin, I feel pain. I have more evidence that there is an interaction than I do to believe that there can't be, because the cause and effect aren't like one another. A theist should have no problem, because if God can part the Red Sea, I ought to be able to raise my arm. Because God, for the theist, God's interacting with the material world is an example of causal interaction, and his omnipotence won't solve the problem, because if it's an in-principle problem, then the amount of power doesn't matter, because God's still a spirit and he can't do it. So I would just say that the skeptical question is overridden by our regular assurance that this happens, that if there's a God, surely even an atheist should be able to admit that if there is a God, then he could part the Red Sea if he wanted to, even though there might not be a God. Well, then you're accepting interaction. And the principle that you can only have like causes and like effects is just not true. By the way, it's not true in science. Particles interact with fields and all sorts of things, and they're different. So,
Right. Okay. That was a cogent explanation. All right. This is a question from Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Are you familiar with him?
I no, but I'm so glad to hear from him. Give him my regards.
All right, here we go. Why would idealism not be simpler, given things like the problem of positive properties or bundle theory directed at matter? A little complicated. That's a juicy one.
This is really tough.
Yeah,
I'm going to have to say that I am open to idealism. Because matter, it's almost impossible to characterize matter positively, because everything that you describe about matter typically involves dispositions, like impenetrability won't work, because impenetrable by what? Well, other chunks of matter. So that's circular. So you can give a negative characterization of matter. And I guess the reason I ultimately believe in matter is because I do think that there is some kind of underlying stuff that can be characterized by physical properties like shape and massiness and so on. But I will admit to you that I don't think idealism is crazy. It's a big problem. I might be an idealist one day a week. I don't know. Well, good being with you, man.
Yeah, good being with you too. I just wanted to say one more thing here. I heard you say this somewhere. Dandy Walker syndrome.
Yeah.
If you could just briefly. Yeah.
I have a picture from a magazine of an X-ray of a Dandy Walker patient, and it's a syndrome where the person has about 10% of a brain. If you look at an X-ray, you can see the skull, and then inside, coating the inside of the skull is a little tiny layer, maybe a centimeter. It's a very thin layer of brain tissue. And it's inside like a balloon was blown up, but the entire 90% of what's inside the skull is a sack of fluid. So they barely have brains, and yet they function about 75% the way normal people do. There are a few things they're not able to do, but they can think and reason and read and get married and talk and do all sorts of things. They don't have brains, or at least they don't have much of a brain.
That's unbelievable.
And you can look
really
it up online, but it's just a fact. I've got I think it was Newsweek pictures. So
wow. All right, JP. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Eric, this has been fun. One of my best interviews. Let's do this again.
Thank you. That really means a lot. I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely, brother. Good to see you.
JP, take care.
All right, bye.
All right.